Welcome to another episode of the Rent Report. This is episode number
5.
Okay, let's go, Hart. I'm Mackenzie Wilson, one of the co-hosts. Alongside me, my other co-host is Hart Hogman out in beautiful Ontario. I'm out in Alberta. This is all things the rental industry. We talk about really whatever we want because we're nerds about the rental industry. So it's been a busy week. I've come off 3 different conferences, two conferences out in Saskatoon. I flew out last week to speak about all things tenant screening. And then I did a webinar here on Tuesday with the Landlord Association up in Edmonton, Alberta. And then honestly, we're coming to the long weekend here for Canada Day. And so it's just been a bit of a whirlwind. Art, what have you been up to the last week since we chatted, which I was in an airport?
Yeah. This last week, it seems like things are winding down on the small landlord investor front. You know, everyone wants to take the summer off. So as June comes to an end, they slow down a little bit. But at the same time, there's a lot of interest in the condo market. There's a lot of interest from US investors right now. So we've been sitting at the table with a lot of REIT managers and financial analysts, and the summertime is a good time to think about the fall market. So there's a lot of those conversations happening right now and kind of analyzing the market, sitting tight and waiting for some rate drops to happen. And a lot of speculation right now, essentially the last week or so.
Interesting. Yeah, we don't really have like right now in Alberta, it's just low vacancies. Similar to you guys now, I mean, that's the common theme across Canada in any major city. It's low vacancy. It's peak rental season, right? Just getting those units filled. I was just talking to you off air. On my own personal units, I just renewed all 4 leases. No one's left the properties. One said my tenants did want a shorter term because they might be buying. So I structured that lease to terminate in the end of January. And it's actually always an interesting conversation because I know, I'll say in your neck of the woods, there's no such thing as a term lease. It's everything's month to month after the fact. But I always approach it with my tenants as saying, hey, like, listen, I understand life happens. It is a fixed term. That said, you give me 2 clear months notice. So let's say we're talking September 1st, they want to move out for. That means if you let me know on or before June 30th, I won't charge you a release fee. You can break your lease. You can always break your lease. There's just costs associated with it. And if I get a lease broken in that second week of December, which I just appall, I hate it. It's the worst time ever to find a tenant. I say you can break your lease, but if you do it in December, it's full fees will be a part of it. But anything after that, you give me two clear months. There's no reason why I can't find or find a renter and fill your vacancy and save both of us costs.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you mentioned that we don't have leases that actually end here in Ontario. And I think either way, having those conversations are really important because the nature of who is actually renting these days has fundamentally changed from a few years ago. And so part of our job as landlords is really to educate our tenants when they come through the door about not necessarily all of their rights, but at least, the basics of how to be a tenant, how to abide by the lease terms, what happens at the end of the lease term, and kind of stewarding them through the process. And so it's awesome to hear that you can have an open conversation with a tenant to say, hey, the law says this, but I'm a nice guy. I'm going to give you, the ability to end a lease with 2 months notice, because that probably dispels a lot of the fear that tenants may have with locking in, as well as, the feeling like they have to kind of pull one over, right? They have to try and deceive you in some way to get out in other ways. If you give them a straight out, that feels like a win-win for everyone. It's probably going to end up better for you in the long term.
Yeah, exactly, right? Totally. And you hit on a really good point that I don't think it's really overlooked by anyone that's active in the industry, but from an outsider looking in that hasn't rented before on either side of the picture or hasn't done it in a long time, is we're in a heavily regulated environment. There's an RTA. There's actually multiple pieces of legislation in each province that govern the rental industry, and as it should, because this for most people is what they call home. And so there's a bunch of governance involved to ensure that things are done right and correctly. And a lot of people on both sides, whether you're the homeowner or the renter, get burned in this industry when they just simply don't know the rules. And like you said, it's not our job to teach them everything, but at least give them a really good foundation of what the expectations are, their rights and responsibilities. And yeah, and it bodes well to first starting the relationship off in the right foot. I mean, this kind of relates to the common theme I was pushing in talking about tenant screening is there's two core areas you got to figure out with tenants. The financial one, which is really easy, it's black and white. It's can they afford it, rent to income ratio, all these financial numbers, credit score, all that good stuff. The more challenging part is you're entering into a long-term business relationship with this individual. Do you want to work with this person? That's really what it comes down to. And I always kind of give the analogy: if the phone rings, you look at the caller ID and it's your tenant calling, does it make your skin crawl? If you have your skin crawling, you don't even want to answer the phone, you haven't figured out that second part. And I would argue, I will say emphatically, in fact, that second part of the figuring out if there's a good fit for the business relationship is the most important part. Because if you do that part right, it will often overcompensate for any financial troubles, the first part that the tenant runs into. If they'll come up with you and say, hey, Mackenzie, you know what? I can't get the full rent to you on the first. I can pay the first $1,200, and then the remaining $1,000 will come on the 15th of my next paycheck. Cool, no problem. So yeah.
Just kind of, and I think that goes down to the element of understanding yourself as well as a landlord. We've talked about this beforehand, but you know, who are you able to rent to? Who do you want to rent to? What does your asset attract? And making sure that those all align, because I think that the fundamental nature of tenants is changing these days. And if you're a landlord that has done one thing, you know, for your 30-year landlording career, and you only will rent to a specific demographic, or you prefer to, if you're renting out these days, you know, in Ontario, we're seeing multi-generational renters coming through the door. We're seeing non-traditional family units, you know, young professionals who are banding together to be able to afford rent. We're seeing a lot of, you know, obviously new immigrants coming to the table, but new immigrants who may not have local guarantors or things like that. So it's a different risk profile of a tenant. And as a landlord, if you're not open to that, if you're not understanding, if you're not willing to help them through that rental experience, you got to be conscious of that at the start, right? Because it's going to be a painful process finding that tenant and then trying to muddle through managing them.
So let's get into that. But before because I'm really curious to see this change that you're seeing in your observations, Hart. I think just to clarify, and I think it's really important for the audience to listen, especially if anyone's on the newer side, is one tenant that might be a great tenant for you, Hart, might not be a great tenant for me.
Yep.
And so there's definitely a level, it's a bit of an art form level of subjectivity to this part. But I've seen a few times in my Facebook group where, again, we're in a low vacancy environment, and someone's like, my post has been up for 3 weeks and I haven't found anyone. And this is a great example of where the product, the way the ad, the marketing's been done, and there's a huge misalignment there that they're not attracting someone when we're 1% or less in vacancy right now. That doesn't make sense. There's something going on. There's a disconnect for sure. Okay, I guess there's two ways to go. I'm curious at a high level what you're seeing these changes are, and you kind of already alluded to it with these multi-generational demographics. So I guess kind of maybe just describe that, and then I want to ask you questions to kind of just understand. I want to understand the impact as well. But first, what is happening?
Yeah, for sure. Ultimately, I think in a market with low vacancy and rents increasing, and you know, we're not talking about month over month. We're talking about, if you look at the rental market 4 or 5 years ago versus today, you know, rents are much higher. The vacancy rate is considerably lower, and we're in a tight rental market. And so ultimately, what that leads to, or what we've seen, is those who are moving typically have to move, right? It's not people who have been living in a home and say, hey, you know what, I want to upgrade a little bit in my rental, or I want to move 2 streets over, or I got a new job and it's, you know, 5 minutes closer to my job, I'm going to move to the next neighborhood over. It's really, the renters are people who have to move. And so what that is, you know, people who are downsizing. We've got people who are divorcing. We've got people who are new to the country. And we have people who are forced out of their homes, whether it's, you know, legally or not, landlords sell properties and people have to move on because the buyers assume them for their own use. So ultimately, that's kind of the fundamental change is more people who are moving are in that group of you have to move versus you want to
Okay,
move.
I don't want to call it a
Yeah.
level of desperation, but there is
Mhm.
there's either whether
It's a
it's an
need
outside
versus a
factor.
want.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's okay. So they have to move. So we're not seeing any tenants move right now because they want to move for. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a few, but it's a.
The very large majority have to move. Yeah.
And then you also mentioned like multi-generational renters. Like what do you mean by that? Is it you got grandma and grandpa renting with their kids in some cases, or what
Yeah.
do you? Yeah.
Yeah. So as the boomer generation ages, and the reality of renting comes to the forefront, downsizing can happen from a buy sell perspective, but a lot of people are downsizing, and the boomer generation is more involved with their kids and their grandkids than ever before, right? It wasn't the case with the generation beforehand.
Yeah.
And so boomers are downsizing. They're wanting to live closer to their grandchildren. They're wanting to live, in cities, as opposed to, their kids being in the suburbs. More people are raising kids in the cities these days. And so we're finding more and more of a multi-generational home where you have again, stereotypically a millennial, right, who's going to be renting with a boomer, and they're going to be renting out more expensive properties, but it's in this kind of transient world. And so you get these groups coming together who can afford more, who can buy or rent really nice properties, and they're renting in the heart of the city. At the same time, when you look out into the suburbs of the GTA, you find multi-generational housing being provided to relatively new immigrants, or this kind of immigration pattern where one person comes over, lands a job, works for a year, lives in less than ideal housing, maybe room rentals with a bunch of friends or colleagues. And then as they bring their family over, they're going to be adding to that household. So we often see new immigrant multi-generational families. And the relatively new thing that we're seeing is quite stable families renting multi-generationally who have the funds to pay for higher end rental housing.
Interesting. Couple things I picked up their heart is if I am looking to expand my portfolio. I know we're not. I don't like getting into the investing side because there's so many people that already do it.
Mhm.
But I think a key takeaway here, and this is something I've always focused on. It's a little bit easier in Alberta. I'll say I'm trying to buy title with with dirt in the title. Sorry, if you've got a duplex or ideal a single family home as opposed to a condo, you have the ability to expand. But I think the other thing that's really important here is those micro apartments, those bachelor suites, those one bedrooms are just generally going to be less desirable. 1 second.
For sure. And I think that's what we're seeing across the board is the intensification opportunity is really there, especially in cities where, there's, so yeah, I think that you're 100% right in terms of those bachelor apartments, smaller micro units that the condo investor has on the market these days is less desirable. There's less of that young professional moving around the city, bouncing around neighborhoods. They're still there, but less of the population is moving just because rents are escalating so fast. We're really seeing, that intensification opportunity being a massive opportunity of a newly built or newly renovated triplex. The garden suites are super hot. We see these multi-generational families moving into 3-bedroom garden suites quite often because, again, the price point is lower than renting a full large house, but they have their own space. It's detached. It comes with parking. They've got a little lawn space. It is a downsize for the family, but it's essentially like tiny home living, right? And so we're seeing a lot of that opportunity. And I think new immigrants as well are open to that.
So that would be like in your example, just so I can understand like a little bit more of the moving parts here. Multi-generational, we got a 3-bedroom garden suite. So that could be like grandma and grandpa in one room, the husband and wife or the spouse is in the second room.
Yep.
And then they may or not have children in the third room.
Yeah, exactly.
That is definitely tight quarters, but yeah. Interesting.
And I think what they're able to give up in terms of space really comes back in terms of in-city living. Like this is a factor of the GTA and Toronto rental market where this is happening more and more with high value properties close to, transit lines, close to a lot of amenities, things are walkable. And so the time spent in your four walls is a lot less.
Yeah.
And people value being close to those amenities. If you look out, to Hamilton or the Niagara region, it's less common. You get those garden suites rented out by people who aren't going to be in that multi-generational house. It's not going to be as packed because the value of it is just having your own space, not being in a shared housing environment, as opposed to the appeal of a garden suite in Toronto is really the amenities that are close by.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I totally agree on like just looking at a more of a macro level on some of these demographic trends with rents, historically speaking, as high as they've ever been, where I would assume of a household or an individual's income, because that traditionally we target that 1/3 of income, around 30%, 35% is put towards rent. But obviously that's increased and put a lot more upwards pressure on that, where there's this trend towards a minimalist lifestyle because it's even exaggerate the material cost of living has gone up so much. It's like, is it really worth it? What do I want? And I can see where this trend's starting to happen. So you're seeing in some of these scenarios, not just maybe a pair of income supporting the rent. You might have 3, 4, or 5 types of income.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and it really it makes the job of screening tenants a little bit harder, but makes you really reliant on the seamlessness of your digital tools, as well as those qualitative metrics that you were talking about. And so if someone is coming through and they're renting for a multi-generational family, we want to make sure we're meeting the family, right? One person coming through and taking a look at the house doesn't really give us a sense if, grandpa likes to yell real loud or, the kids like to play the drums and it's not going to be conducive for the downstairs neighbors, or just, the family dynamic that's there is really important. And oftentimes we do see that, where the whole family comes through the showing, and it fundamentally changes how we do the showings, right? You have to see that family and understand who the decision maker is and make sure that you're talking to them. Oftentimes our leasing specialist ends up being babysitters, right? Because someone will come through the property and they've got little kids and the kids are running around, and you're trying to kind of make it the best experience for those who are viewing the place. You want to make sure that you're selling the place to the right people at the right time. What's grandpa looking for versus what dad's looking for versus mom. And then from a screening perspective, it sometimes is more costly too. If you've got 5 incomes coming through the door, you need to pull 5 credit checks. You need to do 5 background checks. You need to verify 5 IDs. And you don't want to take shortcuts and just say, hey, you know what? We're just going to put 1 or 2 people on that lease. Because then you get into problematic situations where people will actively hide, the delinquent family member essentially. And maybe a couple of family members will move out and leave that delinquent family member with the responsibility of the property. So you just got to keep your systems really tight and look at each individual, each adult who's coming into the property as an applicant within, the matrix of applications that you're looking at.
Yeah, or the household application, if you want to call it a profile. I'm hearing a pro tip coming out of the woodwork there, Hart. You're saying that you screen every adult that's going to be, and do you put every person of age majority or that's an adult on the lease as a tenant?
Yeah, 99% of the time, yes. Unless there's a situation. So it's important because ultimately, your lease is like any other contract where you really turn to it when things hit the fan. And, if non-payment happens, having 4 people with 4 wages and 4 possible garnished wages on the lease is going to be important. There's also a psychological element to, multiple people being on that lease. And if one person, say, fails to provide their share or loses their job, you've got the security of others and the psychological pressure, right? It's the peer pressure of, if one person is failing, the others will step up to support them.
Accountability.
Yeah, and we often see this in student housing too, right? And so student housing, oftentimes, we just want, like, people will say in the olden days, you get one parent on a lease and then you're fine and good to go. But now it's, you get everyone on that lease because they're going to split it. So if it's, $700 a room and one person keeps slipping and not paying rent, well, the other three on the lease are really going to put pressure on them. So they'll do your job at chasing the rent before you have to chase it. And then, if things do go to the LTB and you do get an order, you have the ability to go after more people and more potential wages and more of a chance of recouping that arrears.
Yeah, and this is a good point. And I want to highlight something that I think is so important that you said, Hart, is a lot of new landlords, and the practice for Alberta is exactly the same way. Anyone that's an adult, I just say the way I word it is, you got more bank accounts to go after.
Yeah.
When you talk about garnishing wages or whatever it might be, but I'll have someone say, or I'll see a post saying, where I've got, I've got 3 adults renting for me, and the one person is the trouble tenant hasn't paid whatever X amount, but the other tenants have paid their share, and they're like, well, what can I do? I'm like, well, go to RTDRS here in Alberta, file for the rent arrears and go after all of them. And they go, well, the other 2 have already paid the rent. It doesn't matter to you. They all have that same obligation on the lease. That's for them to sort out. And your ability to put pressure is don't limit yourself by only going after the delinquent individual. That is their collective responsibility, being on the other side of the lease as their obligation to rent from you.
And the waters often get muddied when there's, unregistered occupants, essentially. It's, you give notice of entry to one tenant, and because they're on the lease and they're in your system, and that tenant wasn't home, so their friend who's staying with them or the person that's not on the lease didn't actually get the notice of entry, and you come in and they make a big stink about it, or you walk in and they're not expecting you in some way. So having everyone on the lease of age of majority is really, really important. And we often have, adult children living with their parents. And oftentimes the parents are confused as to why they need those adult children on the lease. Well, it's important to have them there.
They got
They're
responsibilities too.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Even though they're still living at home, they still have responsibility. And so oftentimes tenants will try and position it as, well, we make $60,000 a year as a household, mother and father, but we've also got kids that kind of chip in. Well, if they're chipping in, if they're adults, they should be on that lease. No ifs, ands, or buts.
100%. As a bulletproof best practice, I would argue that it's straight across the board, and all the problems we're not doing it any other way. Something I wanted to dig into, you had a couple of good points. I'm trying to go back in my memory here. So multiple incomes. So this is really timely, is we just released a new feature. We're actually announcing it this week. This, in the time of recording, is June 27th, 2024. But last week we came out with a new feature called co-applicant, and we've really honed in on making it as less friction as possible to get all the adults in that renting household to complete and fill out an application. So now that the landlord can do it when they initially create the request, when the tenant is going through and filling out their application, they can add in roommates. And then depending on how they add in that roommate, they can actually force that roommate to fill out an application. Or if they don't, we then give the landlord a choice to then still follow up and get an application once they've got the full report back from the initial or primary applicant. So we're really cognizant of getting all that information up front to really build that foundation to start off the tenancy on the right foot.
Yeah. And I think that's where oftentimes we see people come through and, husband and wife are going to be renting, and one works and one doesn't. And so the natural instinct is to say, the income is coming from one person, so that person should be on the lease, and that's the person you need to screen. So, hey, we don't need to pull credit on the other person, or we don't need to pull the background check on the other person. And the reality is that the tools that are out there to screen, including single key, it's not just a credit check, right? You're getting the background check, you're getting the other elements, the ID verification that's coming, soon, and we're all waiting for. Those things are incredibly important, and it's someone that's going to be living in your most expensive asset. You need to understand, the background checks is a great one that people often challenge us on, why are you running a background check? Why are you paying for a background check? What are the odds that someone's gonna, get revealed as a murderer, right? As a thief, whatever it ends up being. Well, 99.9% of the time, nothing comes back, which is great. But that 0.1% of the time, when something does come back, you really want to know what that one, that 0.1% is. And so it's an insurance policy like any other. And so often people try and just, sweep things under the rug from a tenant perspective. So if you stick to your process and just say, we screen every single adult that comes through the door, you can really just dispel with all the storytelling, right? Because there's going to be a ton of it. I'm sure you've heard your fair share of stories. You can dispel with all of that storytelling and say, this is my process. I screen everyone. And if the place is not for you, then the place is not for you. And if that's that's a deal breaker.
Yeah. And another great pro tip, I mean, this episode's laced full of them, but you hit the nail on the head is what will set yourself apart as someone that knows what they're doing as a homeowner or landlord or investor or property manager is having that predefined system and explain it, setting expectations up front, but not changing your due diligence process for someone else's emergency. Yes, you can be empathetic, not sympathetic. You be empathetic and recognize their challenges, but it is at the end of the day, it's not your responsibility or fault or the need to bend or break rules or skip steps in your due diligence because of their personal situation. Certainly recognize it, do your best to work with it, but don't skip steps in your process, because that is where people will get burned. And it is a tactic of, unfortunately, the very small minority, but there are some out there that I call them the predators in the industry, and they're on both sides. We'll be transparent, but that's where they'll pressure you to do these things to then allow them to get underneath the radar, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. And I think ultimately it's treating it like a business. Too often, landlords work full-time jobs, right? Not a lot of the population are full-time investors. I think the number is like 68% of all rental housing in Canada is provided by mom and pop small landlords, which means they've got full-time jobs and they're doing it on the side. And those who treat it like a business do, like you said, set themselves apart. And they're the ones that have the lower incidences of, those horror stories. Yeah. How often do you hear of those horror stories where it's a landlord with, 50, 60 units who's living on their street, or living on the street or living in their car because their tenant is a professional tenant? Well, it doesn't really happen because those are the ones with systems and processes. Unfortunately, those who get preyed on are new to the industry or have been doing it kind of the old school way with their gut feeling for a long time. Yeah. But the industry has evolved. We're not dealing with 10 years ago. We're not even dealing with 3 or 4 years ago. And, when we started collaborating, I think some of the early numbers that we pulled, even in 2022, was that there was 2% of all rental applications contained fraud. Now we're seeing 6.5%, right? We used to see collections of 8 or 9% of all applications. Now it's up to 18%. You have to evolve as a landlord in terms of how you screen, how you do your due diligence to make sure that you're really protecting yourself.
Yeah, and we're not saying don't trust your gut. Absolutely. Yeah. It's trust but verify. It's just, I think you're doing yourself such a disservice if you say, well, I the old school mentality, I don't do credit checks. I don't need to. I just do that. Like, why would you not use more available tools to ensure that the information you think is true is it actually in fact true, and get past that educated guess? Yeah. Maybe the only small exception here is if you're in Timbuktu, rural Canada somewhere, and everybody knows everybody. Maybe in those small scenarios, you could probably get away with not doing some of these checks. But man, anywhere else, like you're crazy not to. And again, real estate's so cost of real estate's going up. Inflation's inflation's not going anywhere. Unfortunately, it's going to come back again. You're even risking more and more today by not screening and fact checking. For now more than ever, the most expensive thing you own. Yeah. And like, why would you do that to you? Because I've talked to landlords at so many different conferences, and I've seen ones that have been on stress. I've seen ones on medication with doctor's notes, where their life is utterly upside down right now because they're going through such a difficult process of removing a
Yep.
really challenging individual that if they had done a few steps up front, they wouldn't be in this case. And it's just it hurts my heart, man. Like, it's just, I have a lot of respect. I mean, this is just my personal beliefs again, but I have a lot of respect for people who take it upon themselves to better their own position in life and look after themselves and going down that entrepreneurial spirit. And that's really what this is. As you said, treat it like a business. I mean, that we're going to sound like a broken record. I'm sure this is going to come up many times as we go through these episodes, but it's just so brutally important.
For sure. Mimic that 1,000%. The pain that we feel secondhand hearing the stories of those who've fallen prey to the industry when the tools exist out there, right? And we didn't exist, single key didn't exist 10 years ago. And so yeah, you had to trust your gut, or you had to go to the police station for a background check.
Yeah.
But we're in an evolved industry. And so, unfortunately, the lack of education out there about these tools that do exist is sad, because people get burned when, I wish it was mandated that, a credit check had to be pulled by the landlord directly or verified by the tenant from a pull in order to rent. Like, it should just be industry standard and the legal norm. But unfortunately, we're not there just yet. Maybe we'll make some changes down the line. But it's not that hard to protect yourself with the tools that are out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So two things came up, and so I want to share this with you. I mean, you being with the marketing background, I came across. So like I mentioned, I just renewed my rentals. I chose not to increase any rents this year, but I was just price shopping. I'm probably about in around the range, about $200 below the current rents here in Calgary, Alberta. I came across an ad, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this person says their ad is written basically, something's came up. This is our forever house. We just really put a lot of money. We've renovated. You can tell by the pictures, but because of ABC life circumstance, we now have to rent because I think they got a better job or they're moving for the job. I'm like, basically, they're just screaming, I am completely new to this process. I'm a new landlord. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm telling you that because this is my first time renting my house, that it's my pride and joy. I'm emotionally invested because it's got this amazing kitchen with this whatever Bosch fridge thing that they're talking about. And then this was the written ad. And I was just like, oh, you've put yourself up on a silver platter to be targeted.
I've never seen that before, which is definitely unique. But I do think, typically it's the most vulnerable that are going to be preyed upon, and those who are preying know what to look for. 100%, that person is going to maybe not fall victim to it, but they will be a target of it for sure. And we actually find that, when you mention that story, what I hear is the emotionally invested accidental landlord. And we see that all the time with people who, are in a primary, they decide to move out and level up to their next house, whether it's market or, they want to get into real estate investing, they decide to keep their original primary. Those properties are often overvalued. They're badly marketed because they're going to be pointing out things that tenants don't care about. Yeah, exactly. And that emotional attachment typically gets them in trouble, because if they have an emotional attachment and then they hear an emotionally compelling story about how this new family wants to rent out the place and, oh, they don't have the best credit, but here's a couple documents and whatnot, they're going to use that emotion against them, right? Those tenants are going to see that emotional connection that they have to the property, tie in their emotional storytelling, and those people are going to fall victim. And that's typically what we see. And those people are typically overpricing properties. And so there's things that you can definitely look for if you were trying to prey on these people, that unfortunately, usually have to tie back to emotion, right? And it's the story of how something came to be. And so again, it's just, the solution is treating it like a business, removing all emotion out of it, and either seeking professional advice or treating it professionally is the best course of action to start the safe method of placing tenants.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know one last part to that story was I went through the pictures and they were raving about this appliance in the kitchen. I don't know if it was the stove or the fridge. There was no picture of the stove or fridge. It was in the text, but it wasn't in the photos. But yeah, I think we're at time here, Hart. Good conversation. Hart, I know you're off next week, so enjoy some well-deserved time off after the Canada Day break. We'll have an episode coming out that time. By the time this comes out, this probably come out in about 2 to 3 weeks from now. So we'll keep them coming. And all things rental, the rental industry, come out, ask questions. If you can't find us, we're both on LinkedIn. Hart, what's the best way for people to find you?
Any social media platform, just search for Rent Panda. Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, we're on them all.
Yeah. Challenge us with questions. I'd love to hear people's questions. I'm always kind of curious of what's hard about being in this industry. And we'll share if we think we know something, we'll share it. We'll let you know if we don't know it, but I'm sure we can probably point most people in the right direction. So we'll catch you guys on the next episode of The Rent Report.